I'm Joey D'Antoni, and you're at SQL Bits. I hope you realize that by now. I'm Principal Consultant at Denny Associates Consulting. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And this session is going to be about how to reduce your cloud bill. We have 20 minutes. This is from a 2-day course I've taught in the past, so we have a lot of information we're going to consolidate, but I'm going to try to give you some best practices. A lot of organizations have moved to the cloud, and they think, the cloud's going to be cheaper. The cloud offers us more flexibility. Is the cloud cheaper? I don't know. I think at the end of the day, the costs wash out to be about the same. But there is this concept I call the one bill problem that occurs in the cloud. Before, if you're in an on-premises organization, your various managers and directors paid for servers, they paid for storage, they paid for network services, they paid for monitoring tools. All that stuff came from different vendors. When you go with AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, you get one bill that's got all that stuff on it: storage, networking, VMs, operating system licenses in some cases. So your management sees one bill and can freak out a little bit. That being said, the cloud's not super cheap either, and we're going to talk about the ways you save money. It's fairly basic, but there are some non-obvious things as well that we'll talk about. This session is going to be focused mainly specifically on Azure, but the principles I'm going to talk about apply to AWS and GCP as well. So there are a couple of different ways, things you need to understand about Azure. The biggest thing is Azure, and this is going to depend on the kind of account you have and whether it's an enterprise agreement, a CSP account, or a pay-as-you-go account. But typically, your billing boundary is going to be the subscription level. There are different types of subscriptions. You have dev test subscriptions and production subscriptions. We're going to talk about the impact of that later, but for a SQL audience, the big thing dev test subscriptions means is if you're running something like Azure SQL Database or Managed Instance, you can get the equivalent of Developer Edition, where you don't have to pay for the licensing component, but only if you're running a dev test subscription. These subscriptions also kind of act as security boundaries, but we're not particularly focused on the security boundaries. We're focused on the billing for the purposes of this session. This slide shows a few different ways that organizations may split up those subscriptions. At the end of the day, there's no real right way to do this. Typically, I like to ensure that the subscription is only resources that goes to the same person, whether that be a VP, director, or whatever who's paying the bill, so that there's some level of responsibility there. We see these are grouped by functional, business division, or even geographic. It kind of doesn't matter. The cost model of your cloud is really important. So whenever you're building an app or migrating an app, I always kind of say, if you show me your cloud bill, I can tell you what your hardware architecture is. In a lot of cases, or your application architecture is, I should say. In a lot of cases, you'll have an organization that'll lift and shift their on-prem workload, maybe from a co-location or a data center, running VMware directly into the cloud and just migrate all those VMs. That's a very efficient way to migrate, but it's typically not going to be the most directly cost-effective way to do things. And in order to build your cost model, you need to capture a number of things. So the business workflow, does everything need to be up 24/7? Can it be on demand? What are the latency tolerances? What do your network flows look like? One of the things that costs money that's kind of a hidden cost that a lot of people don't account for is network egress traffic. And that's network egress from the cloud to on-prem, between cloud virtual networks, between availability zones, and between regions. All of that traffic is metered at differing prices. And depending on your cloud provider, this is a complaint I hear way more from AWS customers. But you sending that network traffic across can be problematic. What compliance and regulatory steps are you going to take? This is going to apply to security. This is going to apply to auditing. All of those things may have additional cost around data ingestion and storage, or just tools. Like, for example, Azure Firewall is a really nice solution for monitoring traffic, network traffic, but it does come at an extra cost. Security, Azure Active Directory, all those things. Azure Active Directory has a free tier, but it doesn't meet a lot of your needs. To really meet any structured security needs to an audit standard, you're going to need at least Azure Active Directory P1 for all of your users. So that's something to build and model around. And then finally, availability. Most everything in the clouds are highly available within a given data center. So even a single VM, there's high availability behind it. There are additional hosts. It's not like you're running a single VM on a single host in your data center. And even platform as a service offerings like Azure SQL Database, those are highly available within a cloud region. But if you want disaster recovery support, you nearly always have to pay for that. That's almost never included in anything. So these are all the kind of components that go into our cost model. So when we talk about our architectures and what we want to do, these are some questions I like to ask. Are you migrating a legacy system? If you are, what kind of optimizations you can make? One thing, and fortunately I haven't seen it happen as much as with people moving into the cloud as I have when everything went virtual about 20 years ago, is people are like, oh, you're on a 16-core, 64-gigabyte server. When we go to the VM, we'll make it 4 CPUs and 8 gig. That doesn't work. You kind of have to do like for like. Legacy systems migrations are the most expensive, and we'll talk about why and how you can reduce those costs later. If you're building a new service, it's really important to make sure you take a cloud-based approach and kind of think cloud first and think about flexible service offerings that might be able to save you money. And then finally, can you design a better architecture for an existing application? If you have an application that's maybe running in VMs, but you think could be consumed as services, or serverless functions that might be more efficient, it's worth taking a look at those kinds of applications to see maybe we can switch out this web service for a static web app or an app service, or use functions instead of using a whole dedicated server. Lots of options for what you can do to kind of build better apps. So one of the things I always like to do is estimate the initial cost. There are a number of tools in this space. The one I use the most is the Azure pricing calculator. If you log in with your corporate credentials into the Azure pricing calculator, it is theoretically supposed to give you the pricing that includes any discounts that you may have for your enterprise agreement. One thing to note, enterprise agreement discounts aren't the same in Azure as they are in software. You'll typically see a max of like 5 to 6% on an enterprise agreement. The real savings are on reservations that we're going to talk about later. The other thing that's a challenge is the calculator may not capture all of your ancillary costs. For example, network traffic, egress, or monitoring. So all those monitoring things, some of them are included. Things like metrics can cost extra, and if you're retaining a large amounts of logging data, that can be some significant cost. Typically, you can get, I like to say, within a margin of about 20% by using the calculator. One of the other things you want to make sure you do, because I don't think I cover this anywhere else, is make sure you're choosing the right regions. Depending on your country and your region, prices can be very different. For example, 1 terabyte of premium SSD storage in US West 2, which is Washington, is about $120 a month. In UK South, it's $165. That's not just currency. Don't blame me, blame Microsoft. One of the other things you can do to save money, and some of these things are significant, some of them are not, you can check to see which regions have lower pricing. There's a website called azureprice.net. It's unaffiliated with Microsoft, but it will show you all the VMs and show you where they're priced lowest in the world. Obviously, you're not going to put like a customer-facing VM in Australia, but if like central India is way cheaper and it's a dev test environment where you're just running batch processing or testing, you can save some money that way. And there can be some pretty significant differences. The calculator is also mostly accurate. There are some bugs, so keep that in mind. It may not include the discounts you've negotiated, as I mentioned. And for VMs, you can go to azureprice.net. One of the most important things to understand is consumption versus fixed cost models for pricing. And I'll give you some examples. Virtual machines, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance. These are all fixed cost models. An Azure SQL Database S1 database cost, I think, $15 US a month. A VM costs what their VM cost. What's cool about those things is if you have them at 100% CPU running nonstop for the entire month, they cost exactly the same as if you didn't use them at all. This is a good thing and a bad thing. If you kind of have unpredictable workload patterns, you know what your cost is going to be. And this is where a lot of customers will start in building out an environment like that, because it is very predictable. On the other hand, it can be more expensive, right, than if you have something that auto scales and matches that workload. So this is one of those trade-off kind of resources. But there are other systems that are variable priced. Anything that auto scales can be a little bit dangerous. I always like to joke, I think Cosmos DB is a really cool service, but the cost on Cosmos DB is somewhere between £100 and all of your money per month, depending on how you use it. And the dangerous thing about that, especially with a database tier, you're always one developer writing a bad query or one like rogue API call away from your bill, especially if you're on any kind of an auto scale plan. That can get really expensive in a hurry. Web apps auto scale. That's something else that can be rather expensive because you can set the maximum number of instances of your web app, but if you have it to be unlimited, that can get very expensive. SQL database serverless is something that can save you money if you're not using it a lot, but it also costs more than regular Azure SQL database per second. So if you're using that database 24/7, you want to use a regular vCore solution. If you know it's pausing, you can get away with using serverless. The other two examples I always see whenever I see a project with cost overruns, Databricks, because Databricks can spin up a large number of nodes, and there's a separate, Databricks has a twofold charge. You pay for the compute cost of the VMs, and then there's a charge to Databricks that's effectively a licensing fee. That's rather significant based on the size of your nodes and how long they're running. Large VM loads, we're going to talk about without reservations in a second and how important they are. It's really by far the biggest cost savings you can do. But there are VMs in Azure that cost over $100,000 a month, or pounds probably as well, a month. You can rent a VM that has 416 cores and 24 terabytes of RAM. And if you put SQL Server licensing on that, that's something else that's really expensive. Something else to keep in mind is your licensing. So you can either, I think Microsoft, I forget the official Microsoft term, but you can effectively lease your SQL Server or Windows licenses, which means they're included in the price of your Azure resources. Typically, the payback period on this is 3 years. So if you know that's going to exist for 3 years, you're better off buying the licenses. If it's going to be less than 3 years, maybe not. Storage. Cloud storage is typically cheaper if you use it correctly. There's two kinds of storage you really need to know about. The kind of storage that VMs use, managed disk, that's a fixed cost. So you pay for that terabyte per month that I mentioned. $120 in the US, $160 in the UK. But if you're using all 5,000 IOPS that drive will sustain all month, your bill is the same. With blob storage and some of the other storage classes, you pay for both storage and usage. You get a certain amount of usage free, but after that, you have to pay for utilization. This is that storage, blob storage, you're typically hosting files that are hit by websites. So if those files are being constantly hit, you can see some pretty significant costing there. And then finally, UltraDisk, I'll talk about this. Anybody work for Microsoft? Good. Don't use UltraDisk. UltraDisk, so the standard disk that I gave you a price quote for, the P30, that's a 5,000 IOPS, 200 megabytes per second, 1 terabyte volume. Like I said, 120 to 160 a month, depending on your region. UK is the most expensive in the world, by the way, as far as I know. That UltraDisk is like $440 US if you put that same in. They're both solid state drives. They're both network attached. I've done pretty extensive testing on both of these, And you see a small difference in write latency at the very tail end of the workload. So use premium disk for your VMs. There's almost no need to use UltraDisk. The portal has a bunch of really nice tools for cost management. We're not going to go into any depth in this because it's 20 minutes, but I will tell you, when you're building new services, there's a concept called budgets. Budgets are alerts. They work just like alerts. They're built on the same engine as alerts in Azure. You should, when you're building new services, especially ones that you don't think you have a great idea of how much it's going to cost, you want to get alerted every day on what that spend is going to be. Because if it starts going out of control, you want to be able to make changes quickly. You don't want to wait till the end of the month. This is in the billing section of the Azure portal. It's pretty easy to use. This is by far the most important thing we're going to talk about, because there's a bunch of things we can do to save money. We can switch to flexible resources. We can power off VMs at night that our developers aren't using. And sure, that'll save you a few quid. But the way you can really save money is by reserving resources. So you can reserve virtual machines, storage, Azure SQL Database, Databricks, Azure Synapse Analytics. Most of the first-party Microsoft solutions you can reserve. These reservations are for 1 to 3 year periods, and they'll get you discounts for between 20 and up to 72%. You'll see bigger discounts on VMs and on compute than you will storage, which leads me to believe Microsoft's margins are a lot lower on storage than they are in compute. And when reservations started, they were originally only paid upfront or capital expense. But now you can pay them month to month to make them operating expense, so your finance people can be happy no matter what you do. They are connected to an Azure region, and there is some flexibility within reservations. So you can exchange a reservation for the same reservation of the same type. You can split a reservation into smaller parts. So what does that mean? If I reserve 32 cores of a virtual machine in UK South, and I wanted to change that into 4 8-core VMs, I can do that. You can refund a reservation of up to $50,000 US in a 12-month period. And large reservations may occur a penalty for cancellations. It's a typo on my slide. This is slightly changing as Microsoft is moving into more of a savings plan model. This is one of those times where Microsoft is moving into something where they don't fully have the replacement, because reservations don't match savings plans one for one. But this is how you save significant amounts of money. I had a customer where I looked at last month on 2 VMs. Their monthly cost would have gone down by approximately $60,000 if they had had reservations, because they were, like big 64-core VMs with 1.7 terabytes of RAM. So there are a few other ways to save money, but reservations are the big one. Use auto shutdown to power off dev test VMs when not in use. You'll notice there's no auto startup feature, there's only an auto shutdown. I don't know why anyone made this decision, but if you look in Azure Automation, the most popular user-supplied runbooks are all start up your VMs on a schedule, which I kind of find amusing. When you power off a VM, you can convert premium disk to standard disk. This is something I do in my demo environment, and it is something I've done for a client once or twice, but it's not a huge amount of savings, but it is savings. And evaluate downscaling VMs where possible. The portal will make recommendations in Azure Advisor if they think your compute is over-allocated. Serverless options. I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to go through all these. It's important to understand the pricing models of these in terms of what the pay-as-you-go prices versus the fully dedicated price. Like I mentioned, Azure SQL Database Serverless costs more per second, but it will auto-pause after an hour. And when it pauses, you're only paying for the storage. So that's an important thing to note. Azure Functions are consumption. But if they run for hours at a time, we had a customer who had functions as the largest line item on their bill because they had really poor indexing in their database, so their function calls were taking a very long time to complete. And since it was pay-as-you-go, it was costing a lot of money. So while we tuned their database, we had them convert their functions to the paid model, which isn't consumption-based. So optimizing and turning off cloud resources can help you a little bit, but in the end, these savings are going to be minimal. Be wary of variable price resources. Remember, Databricks can be really expensive. I always see Databricks on my most expensive cloud projects. Take advantage of dev test subscriptions to reduce licensing cost. And then finally, the major cost savings in the cloud are going to be related to reservations and savings plans. So you want to take the time to understand those. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.